Our speaker at this session on desegregation in housing, Mr. Nathaniel Colley, is a well-known attorney in our community. Besides his general law practice in Sacramento, he has been the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Council in Sacramento and San Francisco public housing cases. I regard it a distinct honor and privilege to present my friend Mr. Colley to you.
Today I'm to discuss with you rather briefly the subject of desegregation in housing. I think it's a truism to say that few needs of mankind are more basic than the requirement of a roof over his head. Yet, in this basic area, we have had quite an interesting development of legal principles. I don't know whether originally there were any restrictive covenants in the caves, or whether restrictive covenants are an incident of civilization. But the fact is, at a very early state in our development, we developed a rather complex body of land law. So often we hear people say that there should be no restrictions upon the use of land by an owner, because a man owns his property, and in a capitalistic system he ought to be able to do that which he pleases with it. Let me assure you that this concept has never found legal acceptance in the history of Anglo-Saxon law. This is why you never hear of anybody leasing land in America or in England for 200 or 300 years. You cannot, in this generation, place your mark upon land so far as its use in many generations to come. There are very definite limitations as to how long you might impair the use of property. Then we have another very definite and ancient restriction upon the use of land. This is found in our zoning ordinances. Suppose a man owned a land on K Street in Sacramento, and he owned it outright. And suppose further that we accept the notion that one who owns land has a right to do that which he pleases with it. And he decides that he's going to build a fertilizer factory at 10th and K. Obviously, society would have to veto his choice and make his use of his land conform to values that society has chosen and restrictions which society has placed upon him. But over and above that, there's even a far more overpowering and overwhelming limitation upon the use of land, which is not newfangled, but is rather ancient and older than the American Republic itself. I refer to the power of eminent domain, or the power of the public through its governmental agencies to condemn land. Sacramento State College stands on land which once was private property, and I understand it was quite a good hop field. And maybe the owner might have chosen to continue to raise hops on these grounds. But society decided, through its legislature, that it would be a good idea that in addition to raising hops so we can have good beer, we might have to have some place to educate our youth. So we condemned the land and said to him, you can't raise hops on it anymore. We're going to raise our future generations and educate them on this land. And there was nothing the owner could do except insist that he be paid well for his land. I think housing for residential purposes in America can be classified into three groups. First, there's the private housing, constructed entirely by private capital without any form of governmental assistance. Second, there's housing built with private capital, but insured by the FHA or the Veterans Administration. And third, there's public housing as administered by the various municipal housing authorities. As the law now stands, any one of you could use your private capital, go out and buy you a lot and construct a house upon it, then sell it to anybody you choose to sell it to, or refrain from selling it to anybody you choose to refrain from selling it to. The reason for this is that the main restriction upon sales of land so far as minority groups are concerned is found in the 14th Amendment to the Federal Constitution. And that document is directed against state action only. When I say that, I should say it is interpreted to be directed toward state action only, because I think there's a body of evidence which is overwhelming to the effect that really when the people adopted the 14th Amendment, they were trying to protect citizens against second-class citizenship. But the courts have interpreted it to apply to state action only, and that's over and done, and there's nothing we can do about it. The other major restriction to discrimination and segregation in housing is found in the so-called restrictive covenant cases decided in 1948. Prior to these decisions, builders and subdividers could exclude entire ethnic groups from whole neighborhoods by placing restrictive covenants on the land. And these covenants usually provided that at no time should the land be used, occupied, or owned by any person except persons of the Caucasian race. Quite uniformly, these statutes were upheld by the courts. And if an owner sold to a minority group person, his neighbors could go in and get an injunction and prohibit the occupancy of the property. The thing to remember about the restrictive covenant cases is that they didn't decide very much. All they decided was that where you have a willing seller and a willing buyer, no state agency, and this would include the courts, the police, or anybody else, could step in and prevent the sale. And the state court could not issue an injunction to evict the purchaser just because a covenant said he could not occupy it. We have the situation in public housing, this is the municipally owned housing, where actually it is clearly against the law to segregate people in these projects, yet in California there are many projects which are still segregated. Even in Sacramento, California, where there is an injunction against the Sacramento Housing Authority prohibiting them from segregating, you can go down to River Oaks and you will find that the vast majority of the Negro people live in one little geographical area. And you will also find that the few Caucasians in between are usually of Mexican ancestry. And we objected to this, you know, we made some objection to this, and you know what they told us? They said, now you're trying to tell us even what kind of Caucasians you want to live next to. You're objecting to Mexicans, now you're going to object to somebody else. Well, the truth of the matter is we didn't have any objection to living next to people of Mexican ancestry. We were simply trying to point out that while they were complying with the letter of the law, certainly they were not complying with the spirit of it, and in my judgment, they have still not complied. And this is an example where you can go take a look, and you can also look at New Helvetia, and you see that there's no real integration there either. The most important phase of housing at this time is that insured by the FHA or the Veterans Administration. This group of housing constitutes over 90% of all the new housing constructed in this country since 1940. Well, what has been the record in that housing? You might be surprised to know that actually the federal government has facilitated segregation in housing in this country. In fact, the federal government can be accused of actually causing it. These are harsh charges, but these charges are true. Many Americans are amazed to know that up until the year of our Lord 1950, our great federal government required, mark my word, I did not say permitted, I said the federal government required restrictive covenants on land insured by FHA. Then the Supreme Court declared the restrictive covenants unconstitutional. So the federal government then, through FHA, changed its policy and no longer required restrictive covenants. But instead of actually preventing them, here's what the FHA regulation did. It said that the mortgagee or the person getting a loan through FHA must agree that there is no restrictive covenant on the land placed there by him, and that he will not execute or file for record any such covenant during the life of the FHA mortgage. Well, what the government was really saying to the people, you continue your code and custom by which you do not allow this land to be sold to Negroes, but just don't execute it and file it for record. And of course, the gentleman's agreement went into being and continued for a long, long time. The FHA is just getting around to being goaded into trying to assist in making this housing available to all without regard to race, color, or creed. There's another aspect of this problem of desegregation which we are going to have to pay some attention to. I have reference to urban redevelopment. There's no doubt in my mind at all that urban redevelopment is absolutely necessary, and in fact, in many of our cities, the slums are so deplorable that it is mandatory that they be cleared. But at the same time, there are certain human values at stake here that we are not paying enough attention to. Usually, minority group people are the ones who inhabit the areas first cleared by urban redevelopment. But it seems to me almost immoral for a government to go in and tell a slum dweller, we're going to clear you out, you got to move, you must go, we're going to buy your house and you must move, and then have him go out and face a closed housing market. It would seem to me that if the power of government is great enough to come in and buy your shack, no matter how much of a slum it is, against your will, then the power of government ought to be great enough to say you can go forth and at least compete in an open market, and not go forth and find a housing market created by the government through government insurance closed to you because of your race. What is happening is that Negroes and other minority people are being taken out of the slums because the slums must be cleared, but instead of being given housing which is decent, in many instances they are being assisted by finding for them, quote, comparable housing elsewhere. Now that quote is from the law, comparable housing. Is it good public policy to move a slum dweller and find him a comparable unit? Because if he was in a slum on 2nd Street, what would be comparable to a slum on 2nd Street except another slum somewhere else? And if you're going to simply find him a comparable unit, then you have not done any good, and I would seriously doubt the social utility of moving people from one slum to another. Now, I realize that sometimes when they move, the next slum they go to isn't quite as bad. But what happens is that a Negro family will be moved from 2nd Street, which is already a slum, to some area in Oak Park, which is becoming a slum. And he'll be moved into a house that's probably 45 years old already. And when the house falls down on his head on his 50th anniversary, then neighbors will drive by and say, oh, look what Negroes do to property. The truth of the matter is that age has a part in this too. And when you move into an area already becoming a slum, it is only natural that it will soon be totally slum. I don't mean to suggest for a moment that Negroes keep up their property any better than anybody else. All I want to say is that they're no better in this regard and are no worse than anybody else. Those who are uneducated and in the lower economic brackets, as many of us are, naturally are not going to do as well and by our neighborhoods as somebody who is in a different educational and economic and social group. This is true of Negro people, of white people, of any other kind of people, and there's nothing peculiar about it. The question frequently comes up, what can you as individuals do? Well, this is always tough. But I think as a white person, there's one thing you can do, and that is that if a Negro moves into your community as a result of this trend toward desegregation, I think you can arm yourself with some facts. People will tell you that the neighborhood is going to depreciate, the property values are going to depreciate. You can defy them on this because this is not true. I think the studies done by Dr. McIntyre down at the University of California and his associates and Mr. Laurenti and others indicate that really what happens when a Negro moves into a neighborhood is that the property values usually go up initially, and one reason they go up is because the white people then commence to sell to other Negroes, and the housing market for Negroes is so tight that they are willing to pay exorbitant prices. I can name for you at least 2 areas in Sacramento where the houses were sold to Negroes at prices from 35 to 40% higher than they were worth on the open market. And yet many of these neighbors have decried the fact that Negroes invaded our neighborhood. And in case you might think I'm just talking through my hat, I think it's no slander in telling you 1 or 2 of them. One is off Muir Way down on 4th Avenue, down in that area. A few years ago, one house was sold to a Negro. Immediately thereafter, several houses were sold to Negroes, and a check has been made, and you will find that $17,000 were paid for houses that were worth on the market 12 and 13, and $18,000 were paid for houses in the same value bracket. Another area is not too far from here, over on El Cerrito Way. These are good houses. I have no objection to them. I'm just pointing out that it is not true that white people suffer all these great losses when Negroes move into the neighborhoods. Sometimes we find that the white person has moved in with no down payment in the first place, and he's only agreed to pay $1 the rest of his life, so to speak, so he really hasn't got any equity in it to begin with. But then he sells it, and he sells not only the house and the mortgage that's there, but he sells a fictitious equity to the Negro purchaser. So there isn't much merit in this claim of depreciating property values. But if the white neighbors didn't run, there wouldn't be any real problem. And I think you might well face the fact that sometimes real estate brokers have an interest in making you panic. Because if you run, it means 2 more houses sold. You'll have to buy a house in the place you run to, and somebody will have to buy the house you have run from. So the real estate people suffer to gain a tremendous amount. And then I think the other thing you might as well do is face the fact, as we once sang in our spiritual down in Alabama, there was a spiritual which said that you can run to the rock to hide your face, the rock cry out, no hiding place. There's no hiding place down here. So when you start to flee from your neighborhood because a Negro moves in, just remember that in this day when desegregation is inevitable, you can run to the rock to hide your face, but the rock will cry out, no hiding place, because in your new place you might find a Negro neighbor the next day. And there must come a time at some point where you'll cease to run. In conclusion, let me say that it is my opinion that housing segregation is the key to the entire fight for desegregation in America. Until we desegregate housing, all of our other efforts will be of limited consequence. The reason for this is that schools are, as a rule, geographical units, in that the school district will have a school zone. And if Negroes live in a district, then they're going to go to school there. This accounts for the fact that I could take you down to Oakland and take you to a school that you could stand there all day and look at every child closely with a microscope, and if you found a Caucasian child, I'd give you $10 a head. I could take you to Los Angeles and I'd have to reduce the price. I'd have to make it $1 a head because you could find so many schools down there with not one Caucasian child in them. Now, this results from housing segregation. If segregation inflicts injury upon the children, as the Supreme Court and the sociologists and the psychologists have all said that it does, do you think the injury is any less because the segregation has resulted from housing customs? You think a little child in the 3rd grade cares whether his segregation has resulted from a school board edict or from segregation patterns in housing? I doubt whether the child knows or whether the child cares. All the child does know is the fact that he has been segregated and set apart, and he reacts to it on that basis. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that I have run a little longer than I had been told to run, but maybe this is one way I could avoid having any questions asked. Thank you.